Hi, it's James Clark here. This is a PowerPoint presentation looking at how to share your scientific research. Essentially, it's some advice about presenting your data, how to lay out your slides, and how to arrange your content. So it's about 25-30 minutes long, and I hope it helps when preparing for your research project presentations. So to start with, what are we going to talk about? We're going to talk about how to structure a good presentation. We're going to talk about the simple do's and don'ts of presenting using PowerPoint or Keynote on a computer. We're going to look at some specific research project hints, in other words, how to present your data, which data to include, which data not to include. And then there's time for discussion, but of course this is a narrated PowerPoint presentation, so it's just me talking, and no time for questions at the end, unfortunately. So let's start with some general guidelines for a presentation. Blaise Pascal was a scientist in the 1600s. He was actually responsible for inventing the Pascaline, which was the first calculator. And he came up with an amazing quote, which is still used quite often today. And he said that I've made this letter longer than usual because I lack the time to make it shorter. This applies to all walks of life. It applies to writing abstracts for conferences, it applies to writing discussions in papers, and it certainly applies when it comes to giving a presentation. If you have to waffle for hours and hours and hours to get your point across, you clearly need to spend more time preparing your talk. Most physiological society talks are 10 minutes, and this could be 10 minutes to summarize a 1-week project, or 10 minutes to summarize a 5-year research grant. So you have to be able to make your information concise and get your point across. So always keep that in the back of your head when you're writing your talk. Of course, things happen. You need to be prepared for everything. When I started research, we were using slides, and we used to have these kind of things sitting in our back pockets when we turned up to conferences, and we give them to a projectionist, and often the projectionist would project them upside down or back to front, or and you'd have to be ready to explain what you can see on the screen. We now all take laptops with us to our meetings, and we just expect to be able to plug a laptop in and go. Always take everything you've got with you on a memory stick as well. Don't rely on your laptop to work. And always take a spare laser pointer. Never rely on a speaker or a chairman to give you their laser pointer. If you need a laser pointer, take it with you. If you don't need it, don't. Here's just a little cartoon which you may want to pause and read. So you need to prepare the content. You need to make sure that the content you're presenting is suitable for the talk you're giving. These three words, audience, action and argument, should be considered. Who are your audience? What is their background? What is their level of understanding? Therefore, how much detail do you need to give them? Also, are you going to give them enough detail so that they ask you questions? There's nothing worse than a 10-minute talk finishing and the audience just sitting there staring at you. So maybe you should be a little bit provocative in your data. And entice them to ask you a few questions. What are the actions of the talk? What is the take-home message? It's a term that I hate. It's a term that most lecturers hate as well, but to be honest, we all have take-home messages. What is yours? Does your final slide have a final statement on it? Does it increase the understanding of the audience, so we know what their level of understanding is? Does your talk increase that understanding, or does it make it more confusing? And have you got any way during your talk to assess whether the audience have understood what you're saying? There's nothing wrong with presenting a talk and asking questions of your audience just to see if they understand what it is that you're talking about. And of course, your argument needs to be structured. You need to start with a clear and concise introduction to your talk, explaining what the current level of knowledge is, explaining where we are in the literature, for instance. Use literature review that you've written for your project, and explain to the audience where we currently are, and then develop on those ideas by talking about the methodology that you're going to be talking about in your talk. Show the data, summarize your data, and then give a list of recommendations of where either the field is going or what further research might be needed to fully answer the questions. It's very unlikely that a talk given at undergraduate or postgraduate level will be able to fulfill all of these arguments, simply because we don't have time often in the lab to be able to make recommendations for future research. Often your recommendations might be actually just to repeat the study again with more numbers and trying to develop some statistical significance, but obviously bear those in mind when you're trying to prepare the content, map it out, create far too many slides than you actually need, and then cut down the slides that are irrelevant and only show those relevant slides. Be interesting. Maintain eye contact with your audience. There's nothing worse than having a speaker at the front of the room who's just talking to the blackboard or talking to the PowerPoint presentation, or worse still, talking to their notes. Look at the audience, smile at them, see if they're smiling back. A tired and uncooperative audience is a very bad audience to have to deal with, so try and perk them up by giving them a smile from time to time and maintain some eye contact. Make sure you can be heard. There's nothing worse than mumbling into a microphone and not being heard. There's nothing worse than mumbling into your microphone and not being heard over a conference room. So make sure you either speak into the mic if you've got a microphone, or maintain a nice loud volume so that people can see you and hear you at the back of the room. Try and vary your pitch. It's not nice to be boring and monotonous, so, pitch things up when they're interesting, pitch things down when they're a take-home message, and increase the volume if you get enthusiastic. There's nothing wrong with getting excited about your own research and being enthusiastic. You'll be remembered for that. Make sure you speak with good articulation. A lot of students, especially at King's College, aren't from the UK, and maybe English isn't their first language, so if you're one of those, take time to practice your talk and make sure that some of the words that you're maybe not used to saying, you're used to saying for this talk, because to be articulate is very important in a presentation. And make sure you pronounce words correctly. I'm one for this. I make awful mistakes in talks sometimes where I just mispronounce a word that I should be able to say. It's not a difficult word to say, but just make sure you do pronounce them correctly and be consistent in your pronunciation, so at least people in the audience, if they're not watching your slides, will understand what you're talking about. Don't be frightened of pausing. A lot can be said for a thoughtful presenter who every so often stops talking and allows the audience to just take in what's on the wall in front of them, to understand the slides, to peruse the data, and maybe try and interpret the data before you just waffle over it and tell them what you're doing. Try and avoid overusing expressions. Again, we all do this. I use the word again quite a lot. A lot of us use the word between every sentence, and some people start every sentence with the word so. Try and avoid that. It does get monotonous, and your audience really want to keep on track and on your side, and not get them staring at you and wishing you'd just shut up and get off the stage. Be careful with your grammar. Try and avoid colloquialisms. Try and avoid slang in your presentation, not only on the slide itself, but in what you say. Do not, that's fine, but try and avoid other slang words that you may not be expecting to hear at a conference. What is the focus of your presentation? It's clearly you and your presentation. If you are the researcher, you're the academic presenting your data, you need to make sure the audience can see you, you need to make sure the audience will look at you. There is no point in presenting a PowerPoint presentation and then standing 20 feet away from your slides so that the audience have to keep moving their heads to look at you and look at your slides. If your slides aren't too busy, there's nothing wrong with standing in front of your projection and staring at the audience into the bright light, but equally there's nothing wrong with standing slightly to the side or moving around. You may not want to use a laser pointer, you may want to jump in front of the board and point at things with your finger. There's nothing wrong with that, but make sure that you and your presentation can be seen. A lot of conferences I've been to, they insist you stand behind the podium, and they insist that you stand well away from your presentation, and I often buck the system, step away from the podium and actually get out there and jump up and down in front of the slides. It does make a great deal of difference. Practice your presentation. I can't say that enough times. Sit down with your slides and go through them. I'm using Camtasia Studio to record this, but PowerPoint has its own narration recording built in, so there's nothing wrong with sitting there in your living room with your laptop on your lap and just practice your talk. Record your talk, listen back to it, see if it makes any sense. This is theatre, okay? Presenting your presentation is theatre, it's not improvisation. Please don't make up 10 slides, put them in a filing cabinet, come back a month later and expect to remember what they've got on them. The next slide won't be what you expect it to be, and you'll be just talking nonsense. So try not to improvise. Try and prepare what you need to say before you say it. Obviously, if you've given a talk many times, this will come very naturally. If you've never given this particular talk before, you will need to practice again and again and again. Even if you just top and tail each slide, you can see what's on the screen and you know what's coming next. Run through from start to finish. Don't just go, yeah, I know this slide, I know this slide, I know this slide, I know this slide, because you won't know how long your talk is going to last for. Speak out loud. March up and down your living room saying your talk. Don't sit in your bedroom with your headphones on speaking to yourself in your head, because it won't run as quickly. I'm sat here in my office talking to a microphone, and I know how long this talk is going to last because I'm speaking at the speed I normally speak. So just make sure you do practice it. If you have to, stare into a mirror or use your webcam. See what you look like. Record yourself both visually and the audio, because you'll be surprised how boring you can look or how dull you can sound, despite the fact you think you're actually quite interesting to look at. So, practice those aspects of it. And be prepared for sudden changes. We all use different operating systems, we're all used to different things. So make sure that if you are going to practice and record on your system, check you can do it on another system as well. And I know that's a very daft thing to say, and we all just turn up. And I've said previously we turn up with a memory stick and expect it to work. But I know for a fact if you prepare a presentation on a Mac and then try and load it on a PC, the first thing that won't work is your fonts, and you'll find that your font sizes are different, and then maybe words won't fit on the screen. So practice yourself on a computer that you own, that you're going to take with you, but then also find another computer and practice on that too. If you're lucky to own both a PC and a Mac, brilliant, practice on both. So when you get to the presentation, how do you actually set out a presentation? Well, first of all, you have to choose a title, and I would suggest choosing a title that is short and informative. Quite often, cute or sexy titles are very poor titles. It may sound really funny when you're sat at home and think, yeah, that would be a great title, but in reality it's quite likely to be a rather naff title, and the audience may not fully understand what it is you're actually talking about until you get into the nitty-gritty of the talk. So choose a title that explains what it is you're going to be talking about. As I said before, determine the level of knowledge. Who did the research? Was it you? Are you presenting a library project? Are you presenting a summary of the literature? Don't overestimate the audience, but at the same time, don't underestimate the audience. Quite often, and I've had this done to myself, you give a presentation at a large conference and actually find that the person you are citing the most in your talk is sat in the front row of the audience. So don't assume that the audience know everything, but equally, don't assume the audience know nothing about your topic. You may be preaching to the choir, as they say. And don't include too much information. We generally have a 1-minute rule, 1 minute per slide. If you've got a 10-minute talk, 10 slides, maybe one title and one acknowledgement slide. Try and be very careful with your technical terms. If you're introducing a new concept, you're introducing a new hypothesis, you may be using new equipment, make sure you explain what it is that you're describing. Don't just say I used a pneumatachograph if you don't think the audience knows what one of these devices is. Often in biomedical science and molecular science, it's quite nice to have a simple slide just explaining the technique you're doing. Gene cloning, how do I get a gene to express in a mouse, for instance? Explain it very briefly and then talk about the data, and the audience will be a lot happier for that. And limit the amount of text you put on the screen. 3 or 4 bullet points is normally quite enough on a single page. Don't include huge reams of paragraphs of text. So the format of the presentation is fairly simple. Follow the same format you would use for any written report. Start with an introduction. Then have your methods, and either detail your methods or show pictures of the equipment you use to do your methods. You have the advantage with a PowerPoint presentation that you can use your laser pointer or use your finger and point at various things to attract the attention of the audience. So you can show your equipment and go, here you can see this and here you can see that. Show your results section. Describe your data. Summarize your data. Don't just show all the graphs. Here's a graph showing, here's a graph showing. Show maybe 1 or 2 graphs and then summarize the other data that aren't quite the most important data. Please discuss your data. Don't just say, here's the data, here's a summary, this is what I've shown, good night. Discuss the data you've shown, have a chat about it, say where it fits into the context of the literature. Obviously, if you're giving a presentation of a report and you've already written the report, this is going to be a lot easier than it is if you're just presenting data which you have not already prepared as a written report. So make sure you do read around the literature and be able to discuss what you've got in context of the published data. And then of course summarize, maybe one take-home message, maybe a couple of bullet points. We have shown that X, Y and Z, and there we are. Do not overrun. That's a really big important thing. You may get 10 minutes to present and 5 minutes of questions, and the chairperson may be very nice, and if you're overrun to 12 or 13 minutes, the chairman or chairwoman may say, yeah, fine, off you go, you've got another 2 minutes. It may be, in the old days of the FISSOC, you go to a FISSOC meeting and there'd be a traffic light system of a green, an amber and a red light. The green light would stay on for about 8 minutes, and at 8 minutes the amber light would turn on, and at 10 minutes the red light would turn on and your slide projector would be shut down. So essentially, if you overran your 10-minute slot, you may not get as far as giving your discussion or your summary, in which case it's a pointless presentation. So, don't underrun and allow time for those important questions. You run to 15 minutes, it may be a Nobel Prize winning presentation, but if nobody can answer any questions and you can't have time to answer them, that's not going to be a very good presentation. So just check that you're not going to overrun. It's always worth, again, if you've got an invited speaker, make sure that they know exactly what you expect from them, because you will expect to know what they expect from you. So, if you're giving a 40-minute presentation, drop them a line the week before and say, it's definitely a 40-minute presentation, isn't it? At least you know what's going on, which is good. Don't give handouts at the beginning. General rule of thumb with research presentations, if you're going to give handouts, give them at the end, give them a summary. If you're going to present a paper, give them a copy of the paper at the end. If you give them a copy of the paper at the beginning, mostly, in my experience, the average scientist will just sit there and read your paper rather than watching your presentation, unless your presentation includes something which is not on the paper, which is very unlikely. So save those handouts to the end of the presentation, and they can take them home with them and read them later if they want to, or come and ask you questions about them in a break or after your talk. So, simple formatting rules now. Let's have a look at what kind of text we need to use on our slide. Big rule of thumb, big. Big text is good text. Simple text is what you want to show, and clear text. So big, simple and clear. Can you see me at the back? Can your audience at the back of the room read your text? 28, 32 point font is about right, depending what kind of font you're using, Arial or Times New Roman or whatever. Around that kind of size is about the right size for bullet points or key points you want to show in your talk. And try and keep all your font sizes the same. It's a really daft comment, but really, you don't want to be reading paragraphs where the fonts get progressively smaller as the page goes down, or vice versa, get progressively bigger as the page goes down. It just takes your mind away from what you're trying to read. So keep your font sizes the same. You do need to keep your slides simple. More than 6 lines with bullet points is probably too much, so try and keep it below about 6 lines. And try and keep between 7 or so words per line. You see here, avoid trying to squeeze too much. You sit there with your laser pointer, printing it all this key. Avoid trying to squeeze too much information on the slide, bullet points, the audience have explained, blah, blah. All of this information here is totally irrelevant. You can say this kind of information, so do avoid trying to put too many words on a line. If you put too much, as I've got here, you end up reading it. So what's the point? This will be very distracting. So use keywords. Just put keywords down on the page, and when you want to elaborate on that keyword, it's going to trigger your mind and say, yep, I want to talk about keywords. This is my keyword, off we go. Keeping your slides clear is actually really, really quite hard. You can see I've chosen a very simple template for this presentation. It's got a big blue title, a big white page, and a footer that remains the same on every slide. Sit in the kind of the fonts like Arial and Helvetica. They're easier to read, frankly. Times New Roman's okay, but to be honest, the sans serif fonts like Arial and Helvetica are the best fonts to read. Try and avoid mixing fonts between slides or within slides. We do this a lot. We present all over the place and we prepare slideshows for different meetings, and maybe one week we're having an Arial week and the next week we're having a Times New Roman week, and you think, well, I'll just botch all these slides together and put them into one presentation, and it does look messy. And again, it detracts from the message you're trying to get across. The audience is spending most of the time trying to read what you've written. Don't use scripted fonts. They are really tough to read. unless you're trying to make a point and be all arty-farty, try and avoid using scripted text. They don't tend not to work. And use a simple background, single color or gradient or a simple picture. Try not to be too flashy by having multiple colored super graphics with animated logos and God knows what on them. Again, it detracts from the message and will probably not work anyway when you go somewhere to present it on somebody else's computer. Avoid animations unless they are really, really essential. And check your spelling. I cannot spell. I am useless at spelling, and I spend most of my time trying to proofread my own poor spelling. But do check that what you've written on your slide is spelt correctly and makes sense. These days we have very clever computers with lots of clever effects, fonts, fills, fantastic bits and bobs. It may be your favourite colour, but some colours are actually quite hard to read, and other combinations of colour just look terrible. Pink on yellow, for instance, here isn't the best combination of colours. Although clever text formatting is very nice, and you can do all sorts of things like shadows and reflections and all sorts of three-dimensional effects, they don't tend to work. They tend to, again, detract from the point of the talk. Unless you're trying to be clever, I would avoid using them at all costs. And use traditional colour schemes. There's nothing wrong with black on white or white on black or yellow on blue. A classic slide combination is the way to go, frankly. If you've got all your graphs sorted out on white backgrounds, well, put everything on white. It makes life a lot easier, and a lot easier for you then to combine many presentations to make maybe a longer presentation later. In PowerPoint there's a thing called a master layout. Use it. If you use a master layout, you can then set on the screen what the different fonts you can see here are. They all stay the same. Every slide has the same format. You can see here, this is the format I'm using for this presentation. It's got everything the same, so every slide will look with the same format. And of course in PowerPoint you can set different slides to have different formats with pictures, images, graphs or whatever on them, and this will really help your presentation look slick and also help you to navigate through it easily. And once you've done all that, start filling your slides with the information that you've prepared elsewhere. Okay, so you've prepared the text you want to include in your presentation, you've sorted your formatting, your fonts, your colour scheme, and what do you do about pictures, graphics and videos? Well, inserting graphics, there's no really hard and fast rules, but if you are going to insert graphics like this, where you're trying to explain, let's say in this case, kinase signalling, and your kinase of interest is this little one here, and you're showing everything else that's not relevant, including some pathways that are not relevant to the path that you're interested in. You've got to think about what might be wrong with the picture. Is that the right schematic to show? Maybe you could draw your own one that would fit in better. Showing all this extraneous stuff really isn't that relevant. This is a classic presentation style picture that we see in many student presentations, and actually sadly in the professional presentations we see as well. Clearly somebody has downloaded a PDF file from the internet with some figures in it, has seen the page on the screen, done a little screen capture and then blown up the picture to fit into a PowerPoint presentation. I don't know about you, but I certainly can't read most of what's on this slide. So if the presenter's sitting there at the front of the screen saying, yes, as you can see this and blah blah blah, you won't understand a word they're talking about because you cannot see the picture. So if you're giving this as a presentation, work out what the message is. Maybe it's this first part up here, part A, and part B and part C aren't relevant. So zoom in on your PDF file, get a higher resolution capture of it, or draw your own. I mean, this is the zoomed in version from the PDF file. Hide the bits that aren't relevant. There was a letter A in the original slide. I've just cropped that out and cut it out using a little white square. So hide the bits that aren't important. And probably the most important thing is make sure you put a citation. You can see here I've cited Chris Proud for this drawing in his 2001 publication, and there's no harm in mentioning that when you see the little caption pop up, just in case Professor Proud is in the audience. Make your own figures, of course, is a great way of doing it. Here is a picture I drew earlier. This is of one of our mouse models we use in our lab. It's clear, it's concise, it doesn't give you any information you don't need to know. And you can emphasize that by zooming in on the section of interest and showing a more anatomical view, which the audience may understand or may need more explaining. So it doesn't take long to draw a picture like this, but it can help maybe 2 or 3 slides worth of rather dull text in explaining the technique. And you can point at that with your laser pointer and explain what's going on. Of course, sometimes you need to explain quite a complicated concept or a complicated piece of equipment. This is Ross over in Shepherd's House with a rather complicated setup, and Tony Christopher from the Chaps team has spent a fair bit of time here drawing all of these various bits of equipment, and you can see what he's done is he's ignored things like this little table with the laptop on it. He hasn't put the skirting board in. There are some bits of kit hovering around the background here, and this rack looks rather messy. So what Tony has done is he's tidied up the rack, he's removed all the bits in the background and redrawn this picture. This is no longer a photograph, of course, it's a sketch which you can play with. You can shade your own colours. So if you've got time, it might be worth it. This would take a heck of a long time and maybe isn't worth it for a 10-minute presentation unless also you're including this picture in a thesis or a report. But bear in mind that spending some time drawing a picture might also increase your ability to understand the technique or technology you're trying to explain, so it might help. Presenting data, again, no hard and fast rules, but do avoid putting too much data on one slide. Here I've got part A and C and D. I've clearly missed off part B because I didn't think part B was relevant, and I might want to edit the A, C and D letters so they actually read A, B and C, so it makes the audience a little bit follow you through a little bit better. Try and spread 3 themed graphs over multiple slides. So if you're showing a series of data sets, show them over many slides. Avoid boring the audience by showing them 20 slides on a page and going as you can see from, if your attention is drawn to, etc. Show one graph and go, yep, this is a graph now, we're moving on to the next graph. Keep your colours simple. Limit the shading patterns. Don't have 27 different shading patterns and cross hatches because they may not come out very well on the projector. Avoid many shades of grey, certainly, because overhead projectors and slide projectors don't show these very well, and you may actually be able to get yourself confused by going, hang on, which one of these bars am I supposed to be pointing at? Avoid shadows and 3-dimensional graphs. Excel does 3-dimensional graphs very nicely, but try and avoid them. Make everything 2D, flat, and nice and easy to explain and easy to understand. And if you have to, use larger than usual fonts. Don't restrict yourself to a graph that you've already made for a research presentation, a report or whatever. Blow it up, make it bigger. There's nothing wrong with using a really big figure on a page if your point of interest is to say that these data points are significantly different, for instance. It's nice to have it nice and big, and you can say, look, it's gone from here down to here, and you can see it very big on the screen. So if it makes complex data easy to understand, make the graphs nice and big, cut out any stuff you don't need to show, and just show the essential data. If you're going to use video, which I have done here, make sure the video works. This was a video I recorded on my iPhone and just assumed it would work in PowerPoint. It took about 4 attempts to transcode it to various different formats before it finally worked, and here it is working. So if you're going to use video, use them, but if you can't rely on them, use photographs or describe it instead. There's nothing worse than travelling halfway across the world to a conference with your memory stick and then realising that the video file doesn't work and you've not got the resources to edit it or do anything with it. So you've reached the end of your presentation and now it's over. Or is it? Questions. There's always going to be questions from the audience, and if there aren't any questions from the audience, there will be questions from the chairperson. That is their obligation to at least ask one question of you to try and help you out. It's very embarrassing at the end of a talk to have no questions at all, so the chair will normally step in and go, here's an obvious question. If you're really desperate, you could also prompt the chair into asking you a question at the beginning of the talk. So answering questions, be honest. Hopefully you'll know the answer to all the questions, but if you don't know, you just don't know. So don't answer it. Don't say, I'm sorry, I'm going to answer this and talk nonsense at you. Just say, I don't know the answer to that, but I'll get back to you. What's your name? Give me an email address and I'll contact you when I've found out the answer. Please avoid avoiding. Don't just say, I'll speak around the subject for 5 minutes and hopefully this questioner will shut up and leave me alone. Don't avoid answering. Just say, look, I don't know the answer, or answer the question quite concisely. Don't waffle. Questions normally are, do you think it's a good idea that? The answer will be yes or no, or what's the likelihood that? Just say, I don't know what the likelihood is, I'll get back to you, or this is the answer. Try not to waffle too much. Have backup slides. Have a few extra little slides here and there on the end of your presentation that may explain some of the obvious questions. You know, you may have provoked the audience into asking a really obvious question. Have a slide and go, funny you should ask that question. Here's a schematic I've prepared that explains my answer, and then talk through it. Don't embark on a completely new presentation, but just show one slide maybe that answers it. Maybe expanded information about a technique or a method that you've devised specially for this. You might have glossed over slightly in your method section to make life easier, but you may have an extra slide that just explains that method a little bit better. So hopefully you'll answer all your questions right, you'll get some good questions, and you'll do a good presentation. I'd love to accept questions myself right now, but since I'm in my office and this is an online presentation, please feel free to email me at the address shown on the bottom of the screen here. I'll be very happy to talk to you about presentations of any shape or form. Thank you.